Hi, folks. This is Richard Ricky Garcia, and as part of our effort for the Skywriters Making a Difference campaign, I thought it'd be fun to reminisce, record, and share stories from our drum corps days. I'm joined by Russ Chandler, who marched Skywriters 1983. Tell us about an interesting retreat you experienced while in California.
Well, thanks, Rich. It's great being here. I only marched 1983. So the first part of our tour went to California. At that point in my life, I'd never been to California. So it was quite an adventure for me. But what I remember, one thing about this particular show, and I believe it was around Anaheim, Los Angeles area, somewhere like that. Um, the food, the food was not your typical hot dog, hamburger, Midwestern, Eastern, whatever you want to call it, but they had Asian food, which was really quite a big surprise and a delight actually at the time because once you finish the show and you got to go roam around just a little bit, a lot of times, especially the guys, we get hungry and we want to go grab whatever. So it was kind of cool. And the one thing that stood out to me for whatever reason, and this will be pertinent to my story that I'm going to tell, is the containers that was these big white styrofoam type containers, kind of like what you get for carry out around here, especially if you experience COVID like most people did. Everybody did carry out in the last couple of years. These big things that, they flipped over. And anyway, that'll come to fruition in my story, just so you know what I'm talking about. But at this particular show, and I think Rich mentioned about the trophies were little Buddhas. I mean, people probably remember that probably more than the food. But it was kind of interesting, and neither one of us can remember the actual name of the show, but that's okay.
I
But it
just
was
remembered.
fun.
I just remembered. It's called the Odyssey Classic in Anaheim,
Okay, now
California. I do
I
remember it
do remember
vividly,
that. Okay,
vividly.
that's cool. But at that particular show during retreat, I think this was just a drum majors retreat because I remember being in the audience side where we could actually see the drum majors versus being in the corps and being behind them, and you kind of wonder what they were actually doing. You had all the major California corps, the Blue Devils, the Santa Clara Vanguard. That's back when freelancers were there and kicking our butt. And then there was us, and then there was some other smaller California corps, and then you had the Velvet Knights. You remember those guys? They eventually passed us by too. And years later, an up and coming corps at the time. And if you remember them, you remember they were kind of crazy. They dressed. They were kind of like the Bridgemen of the West, I think, is what I heard them termed as. They dress like that Panama Jack look, kind of like my friend Rich here does sometimes when I've seen him, and which I love. Don't get me wrong, Rich, I love it
Thank
when I
you.
see it that way. I've got pictures of you, matter of fact. But anyway, um, they were really into doing something different than everybody else. And then when they came to, there was an announcement generally over the PA that said drum majors front and center, and so then all the guys and gals would come up front from their units. And it was always fun to watch to see who got there first, who got there last. Santa Clara always made the gesture to be there last, just because it was their thing. And of course, they came up there. But the two guys from the Velvet Knights, there was two of them. They came up there right away. In fact, I think they ran, if I recall. Everybody just kind of strolled. They ran up there.
Yeah.
One of them had their own lawn chair, and the other guy, if you recall, if you were there in '83 like I was, he had a fan on the end of this big stick, and they were sitting there fanning the other guy, and he was taking his hat off. They had a really good time with it, where else everybody else was stiff and,
Yeah.
just kind of lounging, but not anything terrible like these guys. They were just going crazy. But anyway, the guy was sitting in the chair. He had like several of these white containers that I talked about, from the concession stand sitting under his chair. I did notice that. Didn't think about it at the time, but they were there. But anyway, when it came time before it became time for the scores, there's usually that lull, when they're up there trying to figure out who got what. So the guys from the Velvet Knights, they started strolling. They picked up those containers. One guy was strolling along, the other guy was ahead of him, and they went to each drum major and like kind of did some little small talk that you couldn't even hear. And they would take out one of those containers and offer it to him, right? And they'd like pick up the lid, and the guy would look in, or girl would look in,
Oh,
and they'd take
man.
a look and see what's in there. And it's like, kind of pleasantries. And they'd shut the lid and they'd hand it to him. They'd take it, and the drum major would actually put it down on the ground, kind of like a trophy you see, any marching competition. It's like really kind of funny. And then they did that to all the drum majors. They got to Santa Clara. Remember, Santa Clara's here. Blue Devils, probably the previous winter, they're on the very end, so they were last. So in the line, so they got the Santa Clara guy, and I think Rich and I were talking earlier. His name was Garth. I think we kind of knew that. Um, I didn't know him. Obviously, Rich said he actually knows
Garth
to make
Ruling.
this story really kind of funny itself. But they got to Garth, and of course they did the same thing. They pull the thing out, and they tried to do that. And Garth, he didn't move. I don't think he was even breathing. He was just,
Of course.
like stone. He didn't move. I mean, they could have gone all the way around him. He would never flinch. He didn't do anything. And so I think they just kind of gave up on him. They said, okay. And if I recall, they may have even taken one of the containers and set it down and decide. I can't remember. Maybe they did. It wouldn't surprise
Uh,
me. And then they moved on to the Blue Devils guy, right? So they did the same thing. They held up the container and they opened it up, and you could see him kind of look at it. And all of a sudden, he pulled his hand out, just stuck out, and just went right into the middle of it. Picked up some food and just jammed it in his mouth. Right? This is Blue Devils, right? So the rest of us were the crowd was just eating it up, as you can say. It was funny as all get out.
yeah,
But
that was Todd. Excuse me. That was the Blue Devils drum major was a guy by the name of Todd Swanson, and that's just totally something Todd would do.
I mean, it
He's an
was,
acquaintance, an
it
acquaintance of
it
mine.
just kind of broke up everything. Drum corps can be so serious, but then you
Yeah.
had those moments like that. It just precious. I don't know how many people from '83 remember that, but I sure do. And it was funny, and I love to tell that story once in a while when
That's
I'm some band shows or something like that. So
I marched 82 and they did something similar. They didn't have the food. You get that so you were treated to something very special. But what I can tell you is the Blue Devils drum major Todd Swanson. Uh, he's ex-troopers, he was a then he moved over to the Blue Devils as a baritone player, and then his age out year, March, was the Blue Devils drum major. So an ex-troopers guy doing that is something a bit out of the ordinary. But if you know Todd, it actually it makes sense. He's a good guy, and
that's cool.
interesting. His son went on to play for the Detroit Lions.
Oh
So
wow,
he's just
neat.
interesting guy. So yeah,
Yeah.
there a lot going on with the box of food that you saw over 40 years
No
ago.
doubt. I'll never look at Asian food the same way again.
That's a great story. Thanks, Russ.
Hey, thanks for having me.